I want to speak to you today about Bob, because I'm worried about Bob. Now, Bob is a very hard-working individual. Indeed, he actually has had to travel to find his work. So he doesn't live close to his wife and family. In fact, he lives in a different country and sends his money back. But I'm not so worried about the fact that he has to work his long hours, although it would be nice if he didn't. The thing that I'm worried about is the trust that he has to place in the system. And it's a system in which every time he sends his money home, he can expect some of that money to just disappear. So when there's $414 billion sent home to developing countries, and sometimes at bank charges of up to 25%, we're not talking spare change here. Why can't Bob, with his own money, transfer whatever he likes to whoever he likes in an age of email and instant communication? Sounds strange, does it not? Well, he can. And in fact, we all can. And the way that we can do it is by something called Bitcoin. Now, many of you will have heard about Bitcoin, perhaps in the press. They tend to have lots of stories about words involving words such as anonymity, volatility, even criminality. But the reality is that the stories that the press tend to publish about Bitcoin are often not the full picture. So sure, yes, they talk about it being a new form of digital money, kind of like email and cash combined, a way that you can transfer value immediately from one point to another, directly, instantaneously across the web. And sure, they might mention that in some cases, the government and the banks have no control over this new form of currency. But that's where they tend to leave it. And that's a pity, because in actual fact, it's far more than that. So today I want to talk to you about trust. And the fact is that in a digital world, low trust transactions are hugely important. Many years ago, we used to live in communities where we did business face to face. We would go down the local shop and pay cash. We knew the people we did business with. But as the time went on and the economy grew, gradually this position changed, because businesses realized with the advent of the internet that they would be able to transact at distance. And whilst this was exceptionally useful for us as consumers, very convenient, it came at a cost. And that cost was personal trust could not scale. So we had a problem. So we turned to the banks and the large financial institutions, and we asked them to create a solution, which they willingly did. They came up with a big record, which would say exactly who owned what, which they kept behind locked doors. Now, we had to pay them for the privilege of using it, but that was fine. And all was good with the world. And then, in 2008, a paper was published by an unknown called Satoshi Nakamoto. And overnight, we suddenly discovered that we didn't actually have to trust these third parties anymore. Because if we chose, we could adopt a new currency. A currency that was based on a digital age. One which was based on breakthroughs in computer science in a network that was protected by security. In a network where every additional computer that was added would increase the power. And it had to be powerful, and it had to be resilient. Because on every single computer was contained a record of every single transaction that would ever be carried out or had ever been carried out using bitcoins. A powerful concept. And indeed, the network has become increasingly powerful. In its short time since launching, we now have a computing network that is more powerful than the combined power of the top 500 supercomputers in the world. And by putting this network together voluntarily, we've discovered a financial system which is incredibly resilient, because it has no centralized organization which can be vulnerable to attack or influence. So, all very interesting. But as soon as you start playing around with money, people don't necessarily like it. There's a lot of power involved. And people are understandably attached to money. It's one of man's first technologies, after all, along with the wheel and fire. And they saw it as somewhat suspicious that there was such a growth in the value of this technology. So for the first ever transaction that took place was accepted to be in May 2010, when a programmer in Florida paid 10,000 bitcoins to get a couple of pizzas. To put that in perspective, 10,000 bitcoins at today's prices, approximately, is $6.5 million. So, it's an incredible position that we're in now, but it doesn't really matter how people argue about is it a currency or is it a money, because the reality is that either will do. In fact, the real invention is the fact that we have an invention that underpins the currency. And this invention is truly revolutionary. So, when you create a network of computers, it's important that the computers will be able to speak to each other. They need to learn a language so that they can communicate easily. And once those language, that rule, the protocol is in place, then others can go off and build technologies on top of that level. So, for example, you may not know too much about HTTP or indeed SMTP, but I can guarantee you that you know about websites and that you've used email. So, all of this comes together to create a technology that is incredibly powerful. And now we have to work out what we're going to do with it. Because it's so powerful that it fundamentally changes the way that we can approach the development of value. It gives us for the first time the ability to transfer a unique digital asset from one point to another instantaneously without cost. Impressive stuff. But it's also impressive because it shows us a mirror. It holds up a mirror of what's happening in the rest of society. Because there's a big fundamental power shift taking place. And what's happening is there is a shift from centralized bureaucratic hierarchies of organizations to technology-driven distributed networks of individuals. And this is happening all over the place. So this is important because Bitcoin has applied this concept of decentralization to money, but in the same way across society, we have a position whereby a centralized organization is developed to solve a problem that an individual didn't think they could solve themselves. Historically true. Think of media, think of the television and news services that we expect. An individual generally couldn't walk around and collect so much information and then share it on an international scale. So we relied on media organizations which grew up to fill the gap. But with the advent of the internet and social media, suddenly you had a blogger, for example, during the Arab Spring, who had exactly the same power to publish an article directly to the world from her mobile and to break a news story as an international TV channel. This is incredible disruption, and it's happening all around the globe. Now, back in 1989, I vividly remember my dad returning from the office. He was clutching a VHS video, if you remember those. And it was all about the information superhighway. And I remember vividly sitting on the floor in the room looking at this video that evening and watching as this pulse of cheaply colored graphics flew across the screen and a narrator spoke of stories of this magical future where information would transfer instantly from place to place, just like that. But I'd be lying if I was to stand up here to say to you today that I could honestly see all of the innovation and inventions that would come as a result of the creation of the internet. Of course I couldn't. Of course I couldn't see the Facebooks, the Googles, the services that we use every single day. And we're at a similar place with Bitcoin. It's very early days. And in the same way that the first television programs were no more than us pointing cameras at people reading scripts, just as they'd done on the radio, then we don't know where this will take us. However, we do have some indication because what has been created by this protocol, by this set of rules, is the ability to transfer a unique digital asset from one place to another instantaneously without the involvement of a third party creating expense. And we can apply that in so many places now. Because with a safe, secure transaction that we can't challenge, because it's all recorded on a central place, we can start to transfer property. And once we start to transfer property, then things get really interesting. You may have heard of the thing called the Internet of Things, and it's basically the way that physical objects are increasingly having sensors embedded within them. It enables them to be able to communicate with wireless networks. And as a result, there are more connected devices on the planet at the moment than there are people, which is pretty incredible already. But whilst the Internet of Things brings digital identity to objects, what Bitcoin does is it brings an economic identity. Now things get interesting, because now, for the first time, we can have computers, we can have machines transacting with other machines directly, no third parties. They can transact with individuals or companies. This has never been possible before. You might have heard of B2B or B2C. This is M to B, M to C, machine. And we start to herald in a new age because we have the facility to build this and welcome the arrival of autonomous agents. Now, autonomous agents are effectively computers that own themselves. Bear with me. And what they need to do is to have the capacity to buy or to receive and send money so that they can buy the services that they need to keep themselves alive. So, an example would be a self-driving car, for example, could go out, trade itself on the network, have passengers jump in, jump out, pay it in Bitcoin. The car could then use that digital currency and pay a garage directly for a service that it needs, such as an MOT. Crazy stuff, perhaps, but let's bring it back to the present day. Why is Bitcoin important now? Well, it's important now if I ask you this one question, which is, who do you trust with your personal data? Because the reality is that I'm not asking, do you trust somebody to be honest, or a company to be honest, to look after your details? I'm asking whether you trust them to be 100% secure from hacking. And year on year, the incidences of hacking and data leakage are increasing massively. You just need to look at what happened to the US chain Target a couple of months ago, excuse me, when up to 70 million customers lost personal details, including credit card details, home addresses, telephone numbers, names, the lot. You can't trust someone else with your details. It's almost impossible. But yet we hand them out when we enter into credit card transactions. If those customers had been using Bitcoin, that would not have happened, because with Bitcoin, in exactly the same way as if using cash, you do not tie your identity to a transaction. However, let's not pretend that this innovation is all about shopping. It is far bigger than that. And the reason it is bigger is because 1 billion people in this world have access to banking facilities. That means that 6.5 billion are prevented from accessing the global financial community. Bitcoin changes that in an instant. Suddenly, it gives everybody the capacity to act as their own bank. It gives them access to a currency that is not restricted, doesn't care who they are, doesn't care where they live, and can be accepted around the world. This is truly revolutionary, because this brings these individuals into play. All of a sudden, think of the capacity that individuals, that families, that communities have now, the potential to work themselves out of a state of poverty. And you might say, well, how is this going to happen? How will they adopt the technology? 87% of the people in Africa have a mobile phone at present, according to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Nearly 7 out of every 10 people in Kenya regularly use their mobile device to send or receive money. And M-Pesa, which is a hugely successful mobile money platform in sub-Saharan Africa, has now included a Bitcoin wallet. So let's not pretend this is not going to happen. Whether it's Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency behind it that's secured by the same mathematical certainty, this will happen, because the advantages are far too powerful for them to ignore. A faster, cheaper, more immediate, instant transfer that can't be challenged. So whilst you might say, in this country, it's little more than a diversion, and it's just digital money, I would quote the entrepreneur Andreas Antonopoulos, who says, Bitcoin is not money for the internet. Bitcoin is the internet of money, because Bitcoin provides mankind with the ability to reach agreement on a massive scale. It's never been possible before, and money is just the first way that we can do this. So, I would say that there is no other option in reality for so many other people around the world. And like the early days of the internet, sure, the technology may be a little bit clunky now and not too user-friendly, but there the similarities cease. This time it will be different. This time each of us has a mobile phone in our pockets, completing the network and enabling Bob and millions of others all around the world to be able to do something significant with this time and this money that will be saved. So it is up to us as the pace of change accelerates to watch, to learn, and to take on board precisely what these innovations are creating, so that we can come together and we can collectively help to shape the future of our rules, of our communities, and of our society for the collective sake of us all. And that's why Bitcoin's much more than money. Thank you.